Continue on that big topic of the Solomon Islands and this security deal with China. Joining me now from the New South Wales Central Coast is the Deputy Opposition Leader Richard Marles. Thanks very much for your time. A lot of talk of who is to blame for this. Do you have any blame towards the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government? Do you believe they have in part bribed their way to getting this deal done?
Oh, there's been strategic contests in the Pacific for a long time now. And successive governments have been aware of it. And the whole point about what we're saying, what Labor is saying, but not just Labor, the defence analyst community, is that an agreement of this kind with Solomon Islands has the potential to be a real game changer and a negative game changer in terms of Australia's national security framework. That there is strategic contest in the Pacific. We completely accept that. And that's why it's really important that Australia is playing the very best game it can to position itself as best as possible in relation to that. And that's where there has been a complete failure in respect of that contest as it's been conducted by this government. Australia should be the natural partner of choice for the countries of the Pacific. In my experience in the Pacific, I think that's what the countries of the Pacific want to see from Australia, and we're the country with whom they want to engage. But the fact that we've seen Solomon Islands walk forward on this in this way speaks to the fact that this government has not been able to build that relationship with Solomon Islands.
On the face of it, though, are we dealing with Chinese government bribery in terms of this deal being done?
When we are dealing with strategic contests from China in the Pacific, that's what we are dealing with. And that
in the form of bribery?
An enormous challenge. Well, in the form of their engagement in the Pacific. And what that requires is Australia to be present so that we can shape our circumstances as best as possible. And that's where this government has failed. Australia should be the partner of choice for the countries of the Pacific. We should be the natural partner of choice for Solomon Islands. And the question I end up asking is, which minister has the relationship with the government in Solomon? Who has been there frequently over the last year, the last 3 years? Who has gone there when the advice was given that this deal was on the table? And the answer to that is what you see with the Morrison government is a government which has gone missing. Now, that's not taking China's side to... No, but can I just make this point, Tom? Because the Prime Minister's narrative here is puerile and it is pathetic. It is as if to make any criticism of Scott Morrison equals some kind of act of not being in Australia's national interest, which is obviously wrong. He is not above the public criticism and the public scrutiny that comes with being a leader in a democracy. And it's really important that governments are held to account and that oppositions hold governments to account. That is not taking China's side. In fact, it is completely the opposite. What we want to see is Australia's position in respect of China strengthened in the Pacific by making sure that we are doing everything we can to be the natural partner of choice for the countries in the Pacific. And this government has completely failed to achieve it on their watch.
In terms of, though, being able to sort of criticise or assess what could have been done better, it's important to note what we're competing with. Again, do you feel as though we're competing with a country that is bribing its way to this deal because we're not going to obviously go down that path?
We are dealing with China, which is seeking to shape the world around it in a way that we have not seen before prior to President Xi. And we are seeing it with a high degree of strategic contest in the Pacific. And that's through a range of things. What we need to be doing is using everything at our disposal to make sure that we are able to meet that contest and be the natural partner of choice. Now, in my experience, in my experience, there is absolutely the opportunity for Australia to prevail in relation to this. But it requires us to be engaged. It requires us to be present, and it requires us to build these relationships. And that has evidently not happened.
Well, just on that, you were awarded the Cross of the Solomon Islands, the highest civilian award available. Have you directly reached out to anyone in the government within the Solomon Islands since the initial news of this broke to see if you could perhaps help?
Oh, well, it's not my place to do that from opposition. I mean, it's really important that bilateral relationships are managed by the government of the day. I mean, that is obviously the case. And that was the case when...
It doesn't
when
preclude you from using a personal relationship, does it?
Well, it's actually really important that the government of the day is in charge of the way in which relationships are managed. If the government wanted to come to me, the Australian government, and use me in that sense, I'd be very happy to, but they have not. But it's for the government to maintain, to engage in the action here. And actually, I think it's completely counterproductive for other actors to work around the government of the day, because that sends a very mixed message to the countries with whom we deal.
Do you think...
no, action must be done in an authorised way through the government of the day, and they certainly haven't sought to authorise me.
Do you think one of their offers should be or should have been that Australia would build a military base in the Solomon Islands?
I think there actually has been a very strong degree of engagement over a long period of time, which has involved our military in Solomon Islands. And that's through RAMPI, which is the Regional Assistance Mission in Solomon Islands, which actually began under the Howard government, but continued through the Rudd and Gillard governments and continued into this coalition government. As Ramsay came to an end, as it needed to, there was talk, certainly when we were in government, about maintaining engagement at a range of levels, including through police forces, but indeed including through the military as well. But that's something that needs to be worked in cooperation with the government in Solomon Islands.
No, I get that, but do you think that's something, if that would help, that we could put on the table, that you could even put on the table if you were in government?
Well, the starting point here, Tom, is to have the relationships in place, and it's to have those conversations and to know this in a granular way. Now, I felt I did know that when we were last in government. Clearly, I'm not in charge of the conversations now. That's this government. But it's also evident on the record now from what's occurred that they don't have the relationships in place. And I think the fact that as this evolved and emerged, we didn't see any attempt to send the most senior people of this government to Solomon Islands, where the Americans are doing that.
All right.
But there was no attempt by that from the Morrison government. It says everything about the way in which they have dropped the ball here and their failure to manage this relationship.
Okay, a couple of quick ones before we go. Labor, are you still committing to getting the foreign aid budget to 0.5% of gross national income? And would that happen in your first term?
Look, that's it has been our aspiration to get that level. We're not committing that in our first term. But what we have seen is in this government, a government that has walked backwards in terms of its commitment to foreign aid.
But what are you going to do? What do we say? Is that over a decade now? When would that happen?
We'll have more to say about this before the election. I'm not going to go into it now. But what we have seen,
but it's an aspiration now.
Well, it's been an aspiration for a long time. But the precise policy that we take for this election, we will announce at a later date. And I'm not going to do that now. But what we have seen, Tom, is this government walking away from its commitments to foreign aid, and that has not helped in terms of our relationships in the Pacific.
Okay, just finally, boat turnbacks are a big topic now at the moment. We know when Operation Sovereign Borders was first in place, Labor was critical of the secrecy, and you've never actually turned back boats in office. So if you get into office, you say you'll continue them, but would you get briefings? Would you see how they're operating? Would you perhaps amend them if you felt like they needed to be operated in a different way? How would you approach that?
Let me be really clear. We will maintain exactly the same practice that has been maintained by this government. End of story.
Wouldn't you want a briefing first on how it's happening? Because you don't know how it works now.
Well, when I held this portfolio, albeit in opposition, we were offered briefings at the time, so we do have a sense of how it operates. And I can tell you, we will maintain exactly the same practice as this government has operated. End of story. And really what we are seeing here again from the Prime Minister is a pretty desperate Prime Minister who has nothing positive to say about where he's going to take the country. and who instead is looking for every moment to try and create division where it doesn't actually exist. This is the third election that we will have contested, where we have precisely the same policy as the coalition when it comes to the architecture of border protection. End of story. And we will maintain exactly the same practices that this government is maintaining at this point.
All right, there is that argument over temporary protection visas, but it does seem to apply to the legacy load, just to point that out. But Richard Marles, appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Tom.